Welcome, everyone, colleagues and guests, and welcome also to those of you joining online. I know we have a very international audience, and my understanding is that audience includes some people who were at Birkbeck 20 or so years ago. It's great to have you back here for Eddie's inaugural lecture. I hope that we have many of us who might remember Eddie as a PhD student. Certainly some of the other academic staff who have joined online, I know will remember that. Anyway, it is my great pleasure this evening to introduce Professor Eddie Davila, Professor of Psychology and Applied Neuroscience, who will be presenting his inaugural lecture tonight, The Specious Present, a Constant Within the Web of Memory-Cognition Interactions. Now, it's traditional to give a very brief introduction. I will make it brief because I think you want to hear Eddie, not me. But Eddie first came to Birkbeck in, I think it was 1999 as a PhD student. I vaguely remember interviewing him with his supervisor, Marius Usher. Clearly, he stood out as we offered him the PhD place. He had already completed 2 MSc degrees at the University of Maastricht before coming to us. So he completed his PhD here on active memory, its nature and its role in mnemonic and linguistic behavior, and really has become the Birkbeck sort of expert guru on all things related to memory. Shortly after completing his PhD, he had a short postdoc here before he then left to the University of Maryland, spent 18 months or so in the US before coming back, applying for a lecturer position, which he got, and then progressing through the ranks to senior lecturer, reader, and professor. He was promoted professor actually in 2021 at the tail end of COVID. We haven't had inaugural lectures for a few years because of the COVID restrictions. It's taken us a little while to get back into the swing of things. So this is a somewhat delayed inaugural, but we're really pleased that we are able to now do this. I'm very pleased to see so many people in the audience. And to say just a little bit more, I guess, what is Eddie known for? I mean, he is dedicated both to his research and teaching. He's known for both. He has great commitment to what is currently called our School of Psychological Sciences, previously called the Department of Psychological Sciences. I think you were probably a member of the department when it was just the Department of Psychology. So has outseen a number of the name changes. But he is particularly known for his sort of meticulous and historically grounded approach to memory and cognition. And I don't talk to Eddie about memory because there are too many distinctions which I don't appreciate, which Eddie knows backwards. And not only does he know the distinctions between all the different theorists' theories, he knows the distinctions between the theorists at different points in their career. So I tend to avoid getting into these conversations. His approach historically, I guess, has been behavioral, computational, and mathematical. But more recently, he has also branched out into looking at neurofeedback. He's also been looking at things like aging and dementia. So he's sort of branched out quite considerably from, I guess, where he initially started in sort of mainstream, dare I say, cognitive science. He's also made a number of service contributions to cognitive science. He is, for example, associate editor of the JEP, Journal of Experimental Psychology, Learning, Memory, Cognition, and Computational Brain and Behavior. And he has been editor-in-chief of Frontiers in Cognitive Science since its inception in 2009 or thereabouts. Yeah. Yes. So without further ado, let me hand over to Professor Eddie Davila to talk about the specious present, a constant within the web of memory-cognition interactions.
Okay, thank you so much, Rick, and thank you all for coming to this talk. You might think after hearing Rick's introduction that I'm gonna give a research lecture and gonna bombard you with all things memory. Well, one part is wrong, the other part is correct. The one thing that's wrong is I'm not gonna give you a full breakdown on all the research I've done. So that means I'm gonna give you quite a bit of memory stuff here. As everybody goes through the life, you take a journey, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you on my journey, or I'm going to tell you about my journey of when I was there in the 1970s until here. It will be about an hour, so I'll try to put quite a few in there. Normally, you make your plans, and you think your plans are going like this. Yeah, see, your plans are not always going like it should. Click up here, and there you go. You think your plan goes like this, but actually, as everybody knows, plans are actually more going like that, the journey. And I'm gonna bring you down to the journey that I have taken. So my journey starts with an illusion that I saw when I was young. And I'm Dutch. I was born in Holland, in Vlaardingen. And my parents had a car, a red car, a DAF. And probably was like a DAF 66, if anyone is interested in cars. I have no interest in cars, but this is what I found on the web. And we had some family members living in a nearby town, and we would visit them during the day. And then in the evening, when we come home, we come home in a different car. At least I had a really like an experience of this is a different car. This car wasn't red. This car was beige. Like we came in a really different car. Now it was preparing for a perception lecture for the Introduction to Cognition in undergrad course. I looked at various illusions, and one of the illusions is color constancy. And then I remembered this illusion, this sensation that I had about the car. And the answer here is that back then we had these street lights, which are sodium lights. They give very strong yellow color. And this yellow color, of course, will not reflect the red of the car. And as a consequence, what happens is I received or saw that the yellowish car reflected, but because it's dark, it's shaded, so that becomes beige. So I actually experience a beige car. So I go in a red car to my family, and I come back in a beige car. That's my experience, and that's what was in my absolute memory. Now I see that the slide is very truncated at the bottom, which is not great. Let's here we go. Now, we know a lot about color constancy, and there's a nice graph by Bo Lotto, who's a better expert than me. So here you can see that the two shaded areas are identical in color, but if you see it in this left picture, you experience them as different colors. There's other illusions like here, where if you have a yellow filter or a blue filter on top, the same gray color tends to be either blue or yellow. This is all visual illusions, and we know very well how that operates. You might not be interested in these kind of things, but probably it's more in what went on the Twitter feed a few years ago, the yellow white dress or the black blue dress is all the same. It's just a bit due to the brightness of the environment. But what is it about? This is about the experience, the experience of something that isn't there. So I had a strong feeling, a strong experience of going in a red car, coming back in a beige car. Now you might say, well, that is exactly the reason why you shouldn't trust your senses, right? And therefore you should ignore all the senses and then do research more in the what is the ideal world. But in order to work on this talk, I decided to put all the different research that I've done, put them together and see if there's some emergent thing coming out that I can tell you about. I tried. And that's the journey. I tried to make sense of all the things I've done. And what came out was something I didn't expect. What came out was a different understanding of what is called episodic versus semantic memory. And I want to talk to you about this difference. So that means I need to tell you about memory. So let's start easy. Let's start with the textbook stuff. And I see quite a few students in the audience. You will know I have some issues with the textbook stuff. So let me just start things very slowly of what's in there. So we learned that in memory, we have a long-term memory and short-term memory. Long-term memory, you have two parts of that, a declarative and a non-declarative part. The declarative part involves conscious recall, where the non-declarative doesn't require recall. And within the declarative part, we have two types, episodic and semantic, which I will talk about later. Apart from the long-term memory, we also have short-term memory, and there's a lot of people investigating this and a lot of debates in the literature on this as well. And then we also have something called working memory. Again, debates about what working memory is, how we can conceptualize, and what it does. So if you take any introductory textbook on psychology, you will find a lot of stuff on these points. Now, here is where it gets a bit iffy. So if you're now gonna search for the definition of memory, and let's take a dictionary that is well recognized, which the American Psychological Association dictionary is online. You can just Google it and you can type in all kinds of different words in there for psychology. So you can put attention or memory or all kind of different words. So memory is ability to retain information, etc. Okay, so that's what we normally think about. But memory is also information itself. Well, you can see there's some circularity happening, which is not very comfortable. And then memory is also the part of the brain. Now, this is where it becomes really confusing. So if I want to know what memory is, I want to have one definition, not three, and definitely not three that seems to be not interrelated logically to each other. Okay, so that's where my confusion starts. But this talk is about declarative memory, so the aspect that is related to conscious recall. So that's the only focus. I'm not going to talk about non-declarative memory, just declarative. So the ability to retain information about facts or events over a significant period of time and to consciously recall them. Okay, we can work with that. Great. Semantic memory is then the memory of factual knowledge and concepts. Okay, we have no problems with that as well. And then we have episodic memory, and that's where it gets a bit tricky. Episodic memory initially was the ability to remember personally experienced events associated with a particular time and place. Later, it has been updated to also include a sense of self-awareness and subjective conscious experience. So we bring something in there that we kind of already intuited from our first definition. So far, no problems. And it has been also referred to as autonoetic consciousness. So what is this autonoetic consciousness? So this is the describing of a state of knowledge or memory in which one is aware of what's known, and you have also a personal experience related to it. So that's autonoetic consciousness. So it relates to the self. If I am remembering something and I also retrieve that I have a personal connection to it, then that piece of memory is autonoetic, is part of episodic memory. Right? So we can work with this. Noetic is the same type where you have the state of knowledge and memory, but it doesn't come with this personal experience relation with this. Now, you might say these are good definitions and I don't see any difficulty, but let's think it through. So you have this autonoetic memory, which maps nicely on episodic memory. But an episodic memory itself also nicely maps onto this autonomic memory. So it's all related to this conscious recall, this conscious experience. But noetic memory, the one that doesn't have any conscious associated with it, is related to semantic memory. But not everything that is in semantic memory would also be noetic, because if I had in my semantic memory the concept or the information that Lima is the capital of Peru, but I remember vividly that I have this piece of information associated with personal experience, then that piece of information doesn't come from my semantic, but from my episodic memory. Because we defined episodic memory as having this personal experienced concept. So it's not symmetric when we map semantic versus episodic onto noetic and autonoetic. We get something that doesn't fit right. Now it opens the possibility that episodic memory, or the term episodic memory, could just be restricted to the association of the personal experiences, only the personal experiences. Then that works well. But that's not what's in the textbooks. See? So what's in the textbooks is something totally different. What's in the textbooks is just, you have episodic memory, you have semantic memory, these two long-term memories, and you can retrieve and store information from either of them. That's what's in the textbooks. But what Tolkien said in pages and beyond, he said, well, you need to first check if the memory is associated with this personal experience, and only if there is personal experience, you can say it was from episodic memory. If it's not, then it's from semantic memory. But that means I need to retrieve the information first, check it, and then I know where it came from. That doesn't make sense to me. What if we now have this other alternative where episodic memory is actually just the autonoetic experience, right? Maybe we have a separate brain network that just stores all the personal experiences without the knowledge, the facts, and we have a separate brain network or memory system where it's just the facts, and these are associated with each other. That would solve my confusion here. But I don't find that this particular version in the literature, or definitely not discussed in the literature. Okay. So you can see, as Rick said, it's tricky when you talk about memory. And we take a lot of things for granted, but actually we need to challenge what's in the textbooks, because they do get outdated. Now, this is just about long-term memory. We could have the same thing about short-term memory. And I have done a lot of that in the past, and I will not bore you with this now, just to say that people have used short-term memory in different ways, different definitions. We could start all the way back with Lewis James, where he says that primary memory, because he was referring to that at that time, are the nerve vibrations that have not yet ceased. So you have all the nerves in your brain, they do all the firing, and until they have died down, you have this feeling of a primary memory. Fast forward, the same phrase, primary memory, is used by Don Norman to refer to a process, not a store. So same phrase, different thing. John Brown, who was here at Birkbeck, in his famous 1958 paper, he called it immediate memory, just to make a distinction from longer-term memory, which was at that time researched a lot. So he wanted to distinguish from the kind of research that he was doing, so he referred to it as immediate memory, which makes sense. In the 1968, Shevlin talked about short-term store. And critically, he said it is a control structure that is set up whenever it's needed with a passive hand. So now, this is not a passive system that is present or absent. This is now something that you create when you need it. So different people have different views on what short-term memory is. Now I put here short-term memory in with question marks, saying who was the first person to say short-term memory, in a sense of referring to just this primary memory store. Because this is a diagram from Murdoch 67, where he refers to short-term memory as the sensory registers, the primary memory, and the secondary long-term memory. All of that is short-term memory. But later, and still now, short-term memory is just this one component. So again, definitions keep shifting, making it very difficult for new researchers in memory to really get a handle on what short-term memory is. So I see it as this elephant. Everybody is trying to research it, but everybody is looking from a different angle. They all talk sideways. Nobody understands each other, have debates in the literature, and no one's the wiser. So I'm going to take a different approach. So what I'm going to do is I need to make one comment about computer metaphor. You saw this diagram. When I started with PhD, this is the kind of diagrams that people like to create. And they come from this metaphor that the brain, the human mind, is an information processing system, like a computer. And like a computer, there is an input device that would be like the keyboard, which in a human case could be your sensory buffer, like in the eyes or in the ears. You have a central processing unit, your RAM in your computer, that will be your short-term memory or your working memory. And you have your hard disk in your computer, that will be your long-term memory. And of course, you have then outputs, which if you do a memory experiment, that would be verbal report. Right? So that's the computer metaphor of the human mind. And all these theories that came out of the cognitive psychology, quantum science, follow that structure, that computer metaphor. But there's another metaphor that's a bit older, and it's being discussed now more often in the literature. And this is the activation metaphor. Now, this is a complicated picture, and I deliberately put this one in because it is hard to understand the activation metaphor. So let me try to break it down. The idea is that there's one long-term memory, and in that long-term memory, you have a concept here, let's say table. And when you are presented with the word table, or you are seeing a table, it activates the representation in long-term memory. So it activates, and once it's reached a certain threshold, we could say that now this concept of table has entered short-term store. Now, activation can increase, and when it reaches a higher threshold, we could say that now it's part of the focus of attention. So all your conscious energy is now directed to this table, to this particular space in long-term memory, which stores the concept of table. Okay, so that is what this activation-based memory model that was sort of earlier actually does. It has a level where everything is just fluctuating in long-term memory. Then in the yellow bit, if that's that kind of level of activation, it is part of your short-term store. But if it's in a higher activation, then it's really capturing your attention. It's part of your focus of attention. Yeah. So it's like a tiered cake. Yeah. And everybody wants to be on the top cake, but it's only limited space. So then you have this yellow bit in the middle where you have the short-term store. Okay. But I need to tell you something about activation. What is activation? Activation is not, so activation is about accessibility of the mental image. It's not activation of the brain, all the neurons. If you use brain electrodes or you put a person in a scanner to look at activation, that's not the same activation as what's mentioned or meant in activation-based models. It's about accessibility. What you measure in the scanners, you will measure activations of neurons that are not relevant to the mental image. And you might also not record activation of neurons that are relevant because of the way the neurons are aligned, or simply because of what you are measuring with your measuring device. So activation, when I speak of activation, it's not brain activation, although there's a correlate. But what we talk about is accessibility of the information to the experiencer. That's what activation is. Okay. So this is me in 2006, just before I arrived here. You can see nothing's changed. And this is a talk that I gave in 2006. It's a different jacket though. And this was just before I arrived here, and I was talking about this activation-based memory model. It's on YouTube, you can search and you will find it. Sister, who is probably now online, knows it and she has found it. So I investigated the computational dynamics of activation-based memory. That's what I did. Okay. I'm not going to present any equations, but I'm going to give you a feeling of how these equations work. Yeah. So it's a bit of mental gymnastics. I know it's a long day, but a bit of gymnastics. It will be worth it, hopefully. Okay. So we have a long-term memory. Yeah. And in our long-term memory, we have different concepts. So you have dog, circle, plane, all these concepts stored in long-term memory. And let's say you're doing one of those boring experiments where you give lists of words. And let's say these are the list of words I'm going to show to you in a minute. So now let's run through what this activation-based memory is doing. So I'm only looking at what's present in primary memory, in the short-term store. So I present the word dog to you. You commit it to memory. So what happens? The dog representation gets active. So now that's in your focus of attention. Right? Same thing as what I said before. Now we go to lamp. Okay. Now lamp will be activated. And that will be your focus of attention. But dog will be a little bit less, because you shift your attention to lamp now. Then we go to apple and to chair. You can see that every time you see another word, the previous ones are not fully back down to zero. It lingers on a bit. So because it's still in yellow, we say it's still in short-term store. But there will be a point where the earliest one will be out of the short-term store. It hasn't disappeared. It's not out of your mind, so to speak. It's still there, but the activation is less, meaning it is now less accessible. And here we end up with circle, and you can see that every time I do this, there's now a small number of elements or a small number of representations that remain active, that are at least in the yellow bit. Well, that's your short-term capacity. And we'll see that you can vary that capacity. Okay, so that's in a nutshell how the model works without equations. And I've done lots of work on this. So the theory is simple long-term memory store, where the active part of long-term memory is the content of short-term store. And these active representations compete for accessibility. You cannot have all of them active at the same time, because then your head explodes, right? So there's some competition going on. Now, episodic memory, as I conceived it there, is related to the associations between active long-term memory representations and some temporal representation. It is not a dual store model. I've been involved in earlier debates and say, oh, you have a dual store model. And then I say, no, I have a dual trace model. Read the paper carefully. I said dual trace, not dual store model. But people still refer to my model as a dual store model. I have two traces. One is a short-lived activation trace, and another one is a longer-lived associations, the connections between areas in the brain, these longer-lived associations. So that's what I did during my PhD. And after that, it seems that memory is everywhere. So I'm going to give you an example. So here is, again, the same long-term memory store with the representations in there. And now I put links between words that are related. So knife and fork, table and chair, dog and cat. I put links between them. Now, what would happen if I now activate one of those words? Let's activate chair. Okay, I activate chair. But I have this cross-link to table because it's related to that. So a little bit of those activation would spread to table. Okay, so if I present chair, then I also reactivate some of its neighbors, its semantic neighborhood. And we know this, we have lots of paradigms where we can test this. But what would happen if you put this in a short-term memory study? So here's a study that we've done many years ago. And I'm going to present you in the top left corner a word fragment. So a short word that is missing one letter. And you have to guess what the letter is. And you can do that by saying out loud what the word is that comes to mind immediately. Yeah? Okay, let's see if we can do it. Ready? 1, 2. Milk. Milk. Okay. So 76% of the population says milk. 24% of the population says silk. Okay. So milk is the dominant answer here. Okay. Ready for the next one? It will appear underneath. Yeah. 1, 2. Flour. Oh, what is it now? Yes. Okay. 93% of people say floor. 7% of people say flour. All right. So clearly, floor is the dominant answer here. Okay. Final comes underneath floor. 1, 2. What? Place. Okay. Place is 69%, plane 12%, and plate 19%. So what you can see is until you know the answer, you don't know what to fill in, right? But there's a bias. Some things are more likely than others. Okay. Can we make use of that in our experiment? And if so, how would our model explain this? Okay. So here's an example. So here I have a snapshot of the time after the word pen is presented. And here I have presented first cat, then scarf, then pen. So you can see that cat is quite weak, scarf is a bit stronger, and pen, of course, is the focus of attention. But all of them have spread the activations to their semantic neighborhood. Now you can see what happens here. I have presented scarf in this 3-item list, and therefore silk is pre-activated. But milk, I haven't presented milk at all. So that's not strongly active. But what would happen if I now give you this fragment, ilk? Will you now say milk because that's the dominant response that people have? Or will you say silk because that is now in your species present? Okay. Of course, you know what the answer is, right? So here is a plot where you can see the different positions on x coordinate, and the height of the bar represents the number of times the context word is given. So in this case, silk. Right? So the higher the bar, the more likely it is that silk is given. Now, if silk was present at the very first position, it will now have decayed to quite a low level, and the bias is not strong. But if it's at the end of the list, the bias is stronger, and then you will be more likely to say silk in response to buildup. So need to look at the light gray bars here. This is the model data, the model results, and this is actual human data. So what you see here is the behavioral response or your memory response is tracking the activation gradient in memory. Now, if you think that short-term storage is just you put something in and you take something out, then there is no activation gradient. It's just zeros and ones. But as soon as you have an activation gradient, you get different behavior. So here's an example of a memory test. Now, in order to do this, and we simulated this, of course. In order to do this, we run the simulation and look at what's active. And what we've noticed, you can see here, I present 3 items, but about 5 representations have some activation. So I've increased my capacity just by making use of the semantic things. And we've done lots of work on semantic connections in short-term memory. We've have a test called the conceptual span test, which we developed a long time ago, which is now translated in India and in Holland as well. They're using in developmental work and other work. We also looked at aging and MCI, all related to the activation in short-term memory and how that influences the behavior. So this is useful. It drives our research in this area. But there's something else we can also do. We can also go outside of the domain of memory. So here's a really cool one about attention. So if you are presented with an array here of 4 images, like a guitar, a boat, jacket, and someone playing football, and you look at where the person's eye movements are going, because people just scan whatever's on the screen. So you have this image appearing, and then your eyes are moving somewhere, and you're going to see what is the first location where the eyes land. Right? Now, if I just present you this visual array, it would be 25% on any of these 4 locations. There's no bias whatsoever. But what would happen if I present you with a list of words, one at the other, and then see what happens to your eye movements in response to a target that's in the list? So here, soccer, because this was done in America. So soccer would then prime the person playing football. So your eye movements would go to where the footballer is, right? Okay, so that's not interesting, because that would just simply say, okay, you're biased by what is active. But what is interesting is that it's dependent on the level of activation in memory. So if I present a number of words, and then I have soccer presented at number 13, then there's less of a bias than if I presented the most recent. So the activation profile in short-term memory is biasing the movement of the eyes, also in a gradual manner. Right? So suggesting evidence that it is an activation-based approach is really a good way to think about short-term memory. But I have to go into a different domain. I have to go into the domain of attention. Okay. Now, this is a bit more complicated because this was a prediction of the model that I discovered while just working with it. So think of the model as a car. And let's say that I build a car. And I want to see how the car operates. So I tinker with some of the parts of the car and see how it performs. So that's what I've done as well. So I tinkered with the model and I see what happens with the activation profile. So one thing that I tinkered with was the rate at which I presented input to this model. So I presented dog, table, plane, etc., either very slowly or very quickly. What happened here, with a slow rate, at the end of the presentation of all these items, the last few are the most active. And this is something that I showed you already. But if I present you something really quickly, it's as if the very first one that gets active is blocking every other one to become activated. It just has like a dominance over the activation field. So the weirdest thing, and it's the paradox, if I present something fast, I get what's called a primacy gradient. But it's presented so fast, I cannot even rehearse. So this is not due to some rehearsal that's happening. This is something completely different. And I would say this is part of the activation dynamics that happens. Okay. We've shown that in an experiment as well, where if you present something very slowly, you will have better recall for the last few items. If you present the whole list of 6 items fast, you have a bias towards the first item. Okay. It's just looking at this, the bias of the first item and the last item. That's the focus here. Now, this is a prediction of the model that works in a memory experiment. But what if you now have a task that requires memory and would a priori not have any bias? So let's take an example of what your doctor, what your GP would do. Your GP has learned over many years that certain diseases go with certain symptoms. And certain symptoms have a higher probability than other symptoms to be present with the disease. So what we've done here is present people with lots of examples, like disease like meningitis, and then some symptoms, and people also commit them to memory. And we vary the probability of the associations, and people do very well. So we have now so now your GP or the participant has now committed a number of these disease symptom associations. And here's an example. Let's say we have disease A and disease B. And let's say that test 1 represents vision. So if there's blurry vision, if you just know that, blurry vision, then you probably would go with disease A because there's 90% chance that it would be disease A compared to 10% that it would be disease B. Okay. But what you also have is symptoms where it's the opposite, where test 5 is more diagnostic for disease B than for disease A. And this is what people have learned. Now, what if we present the symptoms to the participant at a fast rate or a slow rate and have the critical piece of information either at the first end or at the last end? So we have test 1 and test 5 both be positive. So if you just take that into account, you would say, oh, 50-50 between disease A and disease B, because test one goes for disease A and test 5 will go for disease B. So it's 50-50. That's what AI would do. Okay, now we're going to present it fast and slow. What do we expect? If we present something really fast, we would base our decision on the first piece of symptoms. If we present it slowly, we would base our decision on what happens that will present at the end. And that's exactly what we found. So this is the proportional generation of disease A versus B, and you see a nice crossover interaction based on where the critical symptom is present. Okay, but this is again not a memory domain. This is a complete different decision-making judgment domain. Okay, so that's good, but we want to come back to experience. And the best way to do this is to make you experience. So, audience participation. I will present you with a number of words, which you have to commit to memory. And so one at a time. And I will ask you some questions. Okay. Ready? Okay. What's the word chocolate in there?
Yes. Yes.
Excellent. What's the word chair in there?
No.
Sure. What's the word cake in there?
Yes.
Yeah, clearly chocolate cake, definitely. What's the word sweet in there? Yes. No. No. Excellent. Always works. Wonderful. But you hadn't experienced that sweet was in there, right? It was like cake, but maybe less than cake, but definitely more than chair. So you had that experience. Now, it wasn't presented there, but it doesn't take away that you did have that experience. And I want to investigate that experience instead of saying, okay, how can you get your memory illusions work? That's one thing, but I want to know a bit more about the experience. So this is what I presented, and all these words relate to the word sweet. And this is a very famous memory illusion. There's lots of research that has been done on that. There's almost nothing new you could do in this field, but it's very robust. The key thing here is that there's a strong subjective experience associated with thinking that that word sweet was present. There are many theories about this false memory effect, and I'm not going to say that one theory is better than the others, because all the theories have been tested, and it's always an experiment that falsifies one of those theories. So there's as many theories out there as there are papers out there that disproves the theories. So it is still a bit tricky. My view is that most of these theories, maybe even all, are correct. We just need to find the right measures to find out how much of each theory is valid. Okay, so one theory that I'm going to highlight is this implicit associated response by Underwood, where it says that as you see those words on the screen, at some point the word sweet came to mind. And then you encode that in ongoing context, and then later on you retrieve that. So you have an actual episodic trace of the word sweet. Okay, but how do I investigate this? How do I see this? How can I find out about this? Well, another branch of the memory literature, any experience, if that's encoded in episodic memory, then there would be something called a temporal continuity effect. What is that? Now, imagine if I ask you to describe what you did this morning from breakfast and then going to your office. Yeah. So you would retrieve all the various things that you've done. Are you gonna retrieve them in this way? Like I went to the kitchen, opened my office door, put milk in my coffee, drove down the highway, had beans on toast. No, you're not gonna do that. Instead, you're more likely to say it in this way. I went into the kitchen, had beans on toast, put milk in my coffee, drove down the highway, opened my office door. Temporal contiguity relates to when the order in which things happened is also biasing the order in which you are going to retrieve things. So if I remembered that I had, if I remembered that I had beans on toast, then it's very likely that the next thing I'm going to say is that I put milk in my coffee. It's unlikely that I'm going to say that I opened my office door. So that is the temporal contiguity effect. Now, can we apply that to our false memory paradigm? Yes, we can. What we can do is, if I have memorized sweet, so sweet comes to mind, let's say after I had beans on toast, then during my retrieval, every time I'm gonna say had beans on toast, I probably think of sweet as well, right there and then. So I will have correlations between where I think of sweet and what happened just prior to that. So in a diagram. So you see the first word, sour. Then you see the second word, candy. Then you see the third word, sugar. At some point, the word sweet came to mind. But at the same time, you have this changing context that goes on that is part of your episodic memory learning. So when sour appears, you have the context which really close in time and space to sour. That gets associated with the next word, candy. And now, after candy, you have another context that is generated, which is an ongoing memory trace. And now what happens? That second context could be associated then with sweet, because now sweet comes to mind. But what happens then? If I now see the word sugar, of course, the word sweet is now pushed out of my mind. And now I connect this context with sugar. I have no idea what will happen with the context after sweet. But what this suggests is that just before sweet was coming into my mind, I had the context associated with candy. So every time I have a list where I have said sweet, I can just see what was the word before that was listed. And that will form a peak if this implicit social response is correct. Okay, so let's have a look. Do you find a peak in the superposition curve, which relates to when the word sweet came to mind? And the answer is yes. Here's 3 experiments. And every time you see that the word that was mentioned before the word sweet was mentioned in the recall protocol is around 4 to 5 words in the list. The word that's said after saying the word sweet, that comes from anywhere in the list, means that there's no change in context that happened when things came to mind. So just the presence of this false memory will not change your temporal context. That's what this means. Okay, so this is one way of looking at experience, but there's another way of looking at experience, and that's actually looking at what happens in the brain at the time of the event. And here's some data of Beeman and Bowden. So this is a study where you have 3 words, French, car, shoe, and you have to come with a 4th word that links all 3 of them. Yeah. So French, car, shoe. It's the same one that I showed in the lecture a few weeks ago. Horn, there you go. So yeah, horn. So French horn, car horn, shoe horn. So what you can do is then ask people, did you solve this puzzle with insight, or was no insight present at the time that came to mind? And so that's a subjective experience. You ask them the experience. And Beeman and colleagues have done lots of brain imaging data. What they found is that the right hemisphere, there's the temporal hemisphere there, is active more if you have insight than if you don't have insight. So there's something happening on the right hemisphere. Also, with looking at brain waves, after you have made that decision of what the solution is, you have more gamma wave activation in your right hemisphere. But now, what happens before you have this experience? There's an increase in alpha at the back of the head that precedes the time when you say, yes, this is the answer, and it came with insight versus there was no insight. So here we have a way of measuring what happens at the actual time of having insight. So there's something with alpha at the back of the head. Okay, so what they've done is to link experience with the neural activation by first asking the experience and then look at what the brain activation was doing. Now, can we also do it the other way around? So to change the brain activation and then ask about the experience. Now, I've done that as well. And I've done that using neurofeedback. Now, what is that? Now, this is really cool stuff, actually. So this is a picture from a study that we've done where we had virtual reality goggles on, and the person had to levitate a vase in this virtual reality space. What happens is this system records brain activation, in this case, alpha brainwave, and the amount of alpha brainwave is then used to then increase the distance of the vase on the table in this virtual reality space. So people really feel like they're Yoda. Right? That's how it feels. It's really cool. Nobody dropped out of the experiment. Everybody wants to have more sessions, but hey. So that's really cool stuff. And most of my recent work is focusing on neurofeedback, mainly on how it works. And I'm guided by, again, a theory that I developed to think about this. This theory has multiple learning mechanisms over different time scales. And you can read the 2018 paper if you're interested. But what we did here was train people on increasing alpha and then try to find out what the social experience is with increasing alpha. So we had just 5 minutes of training, and some people are able to increase alpha in 5 minutes, other people are not able. And after these 5 minutes, we interviewed them. We actually asked them about their experience. So how did the 5 minute unfold? What did you notice? And without any direction, we just want them to tell us what happened. Then what we did was we analyzed the verbal reports, did a version of a thematic analysis on that, and then link it with what happened in the actual brain data. So some people were what we call learners. They're able to increase alpha over 5 minutes. Other people were non-learners. And we want to see what the differences in their verbal reports. What we found was that those people who did manage to increase the alpha over 5 minutes were more aware, or they reported to experience more awareness of the surroundings, etc. Those people who said, or who were non-learners, so they were just basically flat all over the 5 minutes in alpha, they said they were trying. Interestingly, they also said, or some people said, they were trying to relax. Now, typically you say, oh, if you want to increase your alpha, you should just relax. Well, if you give person an instruction, try to relax, you will not increase alpha. It's actually very frustrating for the person because they try to relax, it doesn't work, they feel more frustrated and so on. Trying or efforting is not conducive for creating alpha. But just becoming aware, or in this case, this person, the motor aspect came up quite often. That's more conducive. So we have this dimension that we didn't have before. A priori, we wouldn't have thought that trying to relax would not be conducive. Because everybody says, oh, alpha is relating to relaxation. Okay, then I try to relax. That's not going to help. So we use a qualitative methodology to augment our quantitative data. So this is really great. So now we have different ways of bringing experience or the investigation of experience into the cognitive lab. And that's the direction I'm heading. So we can test assume consequences, looking at quantitative data, neural data. It requires people being trained both in doing quantitative and qualitative methodologies. And I would argue that people who are doing quantitative work should also learn qualitative and vice versa. People who do qualitative work should do quantitative. I'm now trying not to look at my colleagues because and I also argue that we should aim for an integrated methodology and train our students to learn both equally. Right. So now we are at the final stretch. And again, the best way to do this is to give you a demonstration. Remember this long-term memory and the different activations that are happening. Now, what is part of this primary memory? Is it all of them or just the one that's in the focus of attention, the one in red? A combination of them? So what combines them? Okay, so let's see if this works. It's a bit tricky, but let's see if it works. I'm going to present you a number of letters and digits, and I want you to remember them. This will be at a faster rate than the earlier one, but not too fast. And let's see if it works. Okay, you ready? Okay. Does someone want to say the characters? Someone? Okay, that's good. Okay, so that's what I hear. So I wasn't listening to if you were saying the digits or the characters correctly. I was listening to the cadence in which you were saying that. So FSP, little pause, 4-7, etc. What happens? You chunked it. I didn't ask you to chunk, but you did. And what I think is happening is this primary memory or these activations, what's happening is the content that's present is changing or is influencing the chunk or the not changing the chunk, is forming the chunk. So there's no one-to-one mapping between the physical time and the phenomenal time. And I think what's happening is this chunking is related to the phenomenal time. You feel that FSP belongs together as a unit, and then 4-7 as a different unit. But the only difference is whether it's a letter or a digit. Now, the obvious thing to show that physical time and phenomenal time is not the same is everybody knows that if time flies when you're having fun, time slow when you're bored, or even time stops. These are all subjective experiences. The duration is subjective, variable, and I would argue content dependent. So content seems to be experienced as a single event, FSP 47, etc. So what about what this conscious moment is actually for? Why do we even have it? And I would argue that it integrates this continuous stream of information. You have all the stuff going on, and what it does is just smears it out over a longer time period, making you feel that it's just one long event, even though it isn't. And this produces a unit of information that is part of a larger experience with a capital E. This is experience that we can get into. And now we are at experience. And normally people would say, okay, so that's it for the experience bit, but we need to actually have some processes on that. It's extended over considerable time. It's linked to the self, and I would argue it's embodied. It is what makes memory episodic or autonomic, remember? So it is important to understand a bit more about the experience. Now, it includes the present moment, but the present moment is not the same as the experience, right? And the reason for this argument is what William James said is that the object of primary memory, so this present moment, comes to us as belonging to the revered portion of the present space of time and not the genuine past. All stimuli whose first nerve vibrations have not yet ceased seem to be conditions of getting this feeling of a species present. Everything else of the mind is just past. So it relates to the neural substrate. You need to have these nerve vibrations. So that's just related to the species present. But I do not have a long-term memory representation of my experience 2 seconds from now. I don't have that. It's all a combination of what's in primary memory, what I feel myself, and I need to combine it in some holistic way. And I would argue that is exactly what this episodic memory is doing, this autonomic part is doing. For examples, and we wrap up. Here's a Necker cube, which is you can either see it as one where the front part is to the left, or the front part is to the right here. And I would like you to focus on this left Necker cube here, and just stare at it for a bit. And what you will notice is sometimes it looks like it's pointing to the left, and sometimes it's pointing to the right. People have done research on this. It's like it oscillates maybe up to 2 seconds or 3 seconds. And now what you to do is to force yourself to see one or the other. Right? So you have an experience of either it points to the left or it points to the right. Right? So you can do that. Yes? No? Yeah, you can do that. Okay. Now I want you to try to see both versions at the same time. So both the Necker cube interpretation that goes to the left and to the right. It's a bit harder, but can be done. Yeah? Now, what happens to me when I do this, as if I have nothing else to do, I see it flip back and forth, and it feels strange because there's a different 4-dimensional thing that appears. And then, boom, I just see a 2D line drawing. That's it. I don't see any depth perception at all. I just see that. And then I see one of the cubes again. Same stimulus, but my experience is different, and I can control my experience. Here's another one. This ambiguous figure. Everybody knows this. And I want you to look at that, what will be an eye in the middle. So just look at this. You can interpret this figure as either a duck or a rabbit. Yes? So now look at this figure again. And now, just by staring at the eye, try to see both the duck and the rabbit. That sounds weird, but that's really hard, isn't it? I know did anyone manage to see both the rabbit and the duck at the same time by staring at the eye? Yes? Yes. Yeah, but then both at the same time. So what happens here is when you try to force yourself to see both at the same time, not one or the other, it's as if the image splits in two. It's a really weird sensation. But that's, if you've nothing else to do, that's what happens. Okay, but what I can say is you can try to control things in your experience. Now, this is not just only for vision. This also happens in audition. So, what do you hear?
More. 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 More.
Yanni?
More.
Laurel?
More.
Laurel?
More.
Yanni? Who says they heard Yanni? Who said they heard Laurel? Who said they heard both? Who said they heard nothing? That's all combinations. Yeah, of course, both were present. And it didn't really break the internet, but it's a nice example of one stimulus where both Yanni, this is a spectrogram where of the audio, actually audiogram, and what you can see here is the Yanni sound and the Laurel sound are both present. Thing is, the Laurel is in the lower frequencies, the Yanni is in the higher frequencies. Now, people who have difficulties with lower sounds or with higher sounds will have a bias for hearing one or the other, right? So this is a great thing for generational games where the kids will hear the higher frequency, they'll all say Yanni, and the grandparents only hear Laurel, right? So there you go, and of course everyone's off the drain. But you can force yourself to only hear one or the other. That is what people say as well. They can focus on Yanni and they end up hearing Yanni, but when they do, they have no experience of hearing Laurel. And then they can focus on Laurel and the opposite happens as well. Now, I like this one a bit better because this has more illusions. What does it say? Green needle? Or brainstorm?
Yeah, change on the green needle.
Exactly. Right, so it's green needle and brainstorm is both in that audio fragment. And guess what? Yes, people can hear all the other combinations. Green needle, brain needle, greenstorm, brainstorm. You can force yourself to hear one or the other. It's amazing. Once you hear green needle first for 2 rounds, then suddenly it seems to switch to brainstorm. That's really strange. The experience is clear. But you can control it. So I would say that the experiencer, wherever that is, and the controller are not the same. The controller can make use of the experience. And that's where I'm heading. So here we are. Experience. So I started by having this weird experience that our car changed color from red to beige. I can explain it as of 2 years ago. I questioned everything about memory, but then kind of I'm good with the idea that content of short-term memory is an active part of long-term memory. And then I find that active memory is everywhere. Every time you will have an instruction, you are actually using memory. Because people need to understand what you're saying. Right? That means that if you have instructions that is in a particular order, there will be an activation gradient. And that activation gradient might influence whatever you are researching. I've shown you that how you can bring experience into the content research in a mixed methods approach. And the work that I've done and haven't presented has links with that to bring experience with a capital E closer to quantum theories. So, final thought. If our experience is defined by its content, then our neuroquantum system may be defined by how and when it provides that content. And maybe that is the whole point of the quantum system. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the people who helped me in this journey.
Thank you very much, Professor Doubler, for a fascinating journey through, or recollections of a fascinating journey. Can I say recollection? Yeah. A fascinating journey. We are not going to have questions directly to Eddie now. You can ask Eddie questions over a drink outside, which should now be available. But thank you very much for coming to this inaugural lecture. We'll have another one in a couple of days' time, which I hope you will also be present for when we have, well, let's just congratulate Eddie once more. Thank you.